Welcome to the first special Numismatic of National Coin Week 2024. Every day this week, we have a new presentation to help you celebrate. Thank you for joining us. During this presentation, you may come up with questions. If you do, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to send in your question, as all of you are muted on this presentation. Your question will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Before we get started with today's presentation, we are proud to be launching our new e-learning academy on April 29th. The entire first form will be 10 episodes on advanced grading. So we're excited to announce that all 10 episodes will be available starting on April 29th on our e-learning academy. You can easily register online if you're interested in joining it. It's a free member benefit. So make sure you take part. We'll be creating new series as we go along. Now I'd like to introduce you to today's presenter, Dr. Jessie Kraft. Jessie is the Resolute Americana Assistant Curator of American Numismatics at the American Numismatic Society, where his duties include coins, tokens, metals, and paper currencies from all of the Western Hemisphere. Jessie will be presenting Collecting Civil War Tokens, 100 years since Hetrich-Guttag. It's all yours, Jessie.
Thank you, Christian. I appreciate it, and happy to be the first of National Coin Week. Again, as Christian had mentioned, if you have any questions, just enter them into the Q&A, and then we can get to them at the end. So I have a few objectives here. First, what is a Civil War token? So I'm going to go into a little bit about what they are and why they exist. They existed during a brief historical numismatic period, so they're pretty interesting for that fact. And then third, how have numismatists collected them over the past century plus? And also not only how they collected them, but how they have been organized over the past century and a half plus. So Civil War tokens start with a 1 cent shortage without getting into the intricacies of the Civil War itself. Initially, they thought it was going to be a quick war, but as 1861 turned into 1862 and then into 63, there was no end in sight. Gresham's law took hold, which is the economic premise that bad money drives out good money. So as people were getting more and more desperate and anxious about the war to end, and hard currency became more and more scarce, it really started with gold disappearing from circulation. The banks stopped payments in gold. By June of 1862, all of silver was gone from circulation. And a lot of it was actually sold or hoarded or sold to Canada for gold. And there's actually a brief reappearance of Spanish-American silver, which had disappeared from circulation in 1857 when it became illegal, really by 1859. Hoarding of copper nickel cents started from there. So they went through the gold, they went through the silver, and now the only thing that was really left was, as far as coinage went, was 1 cent pieces, and even they began to disappear from silver. Prior to this, there's actually a huge surplus of 1 cent pieces prior to the war starting, and much of that surplus was already in hoards by merchants and whatnot. So much of the hoard or the surplus was already in hoards, and what was actually circulating was then also hoarded up by the individuals themselves. By July of 1862, there was a 4% premium on 1 cent pieces. So if you wanted 100 1 cent pieces or $1 in 1 cent pieces, you actually had to pay $1.04. And while this might seem counterintuitive to do this, it was actually better to do this than to have to succumb to any of the alternatives, which were even more expensive if you wanted any sorts of small change. By 1863, the premium was up to 20%, and this was kind of the breaking point where it didn't make much sense to buy 1 cent pieces any longer. There was a bit of a slip where the premium went up and down, but it never really dipped far enough again, too low until after 1864, which we'll get to. So Civil War tokens come in to take up where 1 cent pieces left off. As the federal 1 cent pieces disappear, they're actually replaced with privately issued tokens. These, of course, being the Civil War tokens. And they were widely accepted because there was no premium. They circulated amongst the public, dollar for dollar, cent for cent. Generally speaking, they're 1 cent size in diameter, but thinner and generally of bronze. There were some larger diameter pieces that circulated at 2 cents, but the vast majority of them are 1 cent piece sized, roughly 19 millimeters, and again, thinner and bronze. So that's why they were able to circulate, is because they didn't have all the metallic content like the copper nickel cents had. The other denominations, Civil War tokens didn't fulfill all of the denominations that disappeared, and all the others were generally replaced by fractional currency, which were issued by the United States government. They're mainly used in the Northeast and the Midwest. Cincinnati is generally accepted as the first place to issue Civil War tokens. There were some other tokens that were issued prior to this, but they weren't necessarily in response to the panic that was happening with the lack of small change. So those, even though they were, privately issued tokens issued during the Civil War, they don't necessarily fit the full bill as being Civil War tokens. There are three main types: store cards, patriotic tokens, and settler tokens. And I'll get to the differences between those three in a little bit. And it's estimated that perhaps 25 million tokens were issued in this 18 to 20 month period, and nearly 10,000 varieties. So there's quite a bit to get through. So this is generally accepted to be the first Civil War token in autumn of 1862 by Mr. H.A. Ratterman of Cincinnati. By spring of 1863, the Lindenmuller tokens were issued in New York City. And then probably one of the most famous is called the Knickerbocker issue, was shortly thereafter by William H. Bridgens. This is the Lindenmuller token. There's a little bit of an interesting story behind them. It's kind of famous. I'm not the first to tell it. It's been told for well over a century now, but they were issued by Gustavus Lindenmuller, who was a New York City barkeep. It's believed that he issued about 1 million tokens in New York City, so it's about $10,000. A common use for them was as streetcar fare, and the Third Avenue Railroad Company actually accepted large amounts of these to the point where they had bagfuls of them, thinking that they could redeem them for larger denominations. But Lindenmuller himself didn't have any large denominations, just like anyone else, because of the hard currency leaving circulation. So the Third Avenue Railroad Company went to Mr. Lindenmuller to redeem them, and he laughed at them essentially, and he refused, and the railroad company had no legal recourse. So they were stuck with all these privately issued tokens, and their only real recourse that they had was to spend them. I like showing these two pictures because, on the surface, they look like the same. One of them has a noticeably large cud at around 11 o'clock. But if you notice, they're actually from two different dies. Below the bust on the one on the right, you could see the signature of the engraver. On the left, it doesn't have that. Also, the dates are two different sizes. So the person, whoever made the, both of the dies was using two different sets of punches. And on top of that, there's actually a third variety of the Lindenmuller token that have 5 pointed stars instead of 6 pointed stars. So there's at least 3 different varieties of these. So it just goes to show you that, if you have one of these types, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to stop there, and you can actually continue collecting even further and get deeper into the, collecting of varieties if you'd like. So I'm going to briefly go through the 3 different types. Patriotic Civil War tokens are amongst the most popular. They typically contain a patriotic slogan or image. You can see the flag there, so quite patriotic. Generally pro-union. Again, these were primarily produced and used in the North, so it makes sense that they're pro-union. Examples of inscriptions are Union Forever, the Constitution must and shall be preserved, and Old Glory, etc., etc. Pictures can include cannons, U.S. flags like we see here, or the USS Monitor, which was a a famous ship during the Civil War, one of the ironclads. These are the Dix tokens in particular. Probably the most famous type refers to John Adams Dix, who was the Secretary of the Treasury in 1861, who famously announced that if anyone is seen taking the flag down, to shoot him on the spot. I like showing this particular token because there are two different varieties of this type. One of them says shoot him on the spot, and then there's this variety which was made in error. You can see it says shoot him on the spoot, so SPOOT instead of shoot him on the spot. Then there's also a third variety that does not have the circle around shoot him on the spot. So that's a fun one. Store card Civil War tokens are different from patriotic tokens in that patriotic tokens really only have patriotic slogans and or images, whereas store card tokens are actually little tokens of advertisement. So one or both sides can contain the name and or location of a place of business, as we can see here. Some businesses could afford two dies to be engraved, so both sides would be specific to their company. Others would only have one, with one side being their location of business and the other oftentimes a stock patriotic die. The third type are sutler Civil War tokens. So these are basically the same as store card tokens in that they name the place of a business, but that business wasn't a specific location, because a sutler is essentially a person who sells stuff specifically to an army regiment and would follow that regiment around. So they're kind of unofficially attached to that regiment. They're a civilian merchant and not part of the army itself. They generally sold stuff out of their wagons or temporary tents and would use these tokens as payment. These of the three are the rarest of the different varieties, not only in number of types issued, but also in survivors for the most part. So the end of Civil War tokens ended with the Coinage Act of 1864. This was passed on June 8th. It made minting and usage of non-government issued coins illegal. It's punishable by fine up to $2,000 and or 5 years in prison. Not only did this act end the use of tokens, but it also made the 1 cent piece essentially resemble a token. So prior to the Coinage Act of 1864, 1 cent pieces were made of copper nickel and were quite thick. And then the Civil War tokens essentially inspired the government to reduce the thickness and weight of the 1 cent piece to mimic the Civil War tokens, which I think is pretty interesting. So Pliny Chase, Pliny Earl Chase is actually the first person to begin cataloging Civil War tokens, and he was doing so while they were still being issued. He is an American scientist, mathematician, educator. He contributed to many fields. I have here astronomy, electromagnetism, and cryptology, but also obviously numismatics, and there's others that I didn't even list. Again, in September 63, became the first person to catalog them. Those pieces he cataloged, therefore, since the war was still happening and these pieces were being issued, we can actually tell, for certain that they were issued prior to a specific date, which is pretty cool. He presented, first he gave a speech about these in September at the meeting of the American Philosophical Society. He was able to compile 303 tokens that, quote, illustrating the trade currency illicitly circulating during the war. These were then published in the 1863 proceedings of the American Philosophical Society. And then he presented his collection of 303 pieces. He donated them to the APS. So this is really the beginning of Civil War token collecting, was as they were being issued still. Here is a small example of his catalog. He listed them numerically, so there's really no rhyme or reason to how he issued them or how he listed them. Just 1 to 303. Here are the 3 different types of Lindenmuller varieties. So the top 2 are the 2 that I had pictured earlier, and then the bottom one is the 5-pointed star. So it's pretty interesting to note that those 3 varieties were known in 1863, and people were paying as close attention to them then as we are now. So I think that's pretty wild. Here's a second little excerpt from his catalog that shows the Dix tokens. Interestingly enough, he doesn't show the shoot 'em on the spoot variety. So I guess to some degree they weren't paying as close attention. But then again, I mean, he only listed 303 pieces, which sounds like a lot, but if you know how many there are now, and if you don't, I will get to that. 303 is actually a very, very small portion of how many Civil War tokens were struck and issued. So copperheads, an alternate name for them were copperheads. That was also the title of a series of articles printed in the American Journal of Numismatics, the AJN, that was still published by the American Numismatic Society. This is the first time they're actually listed by state, but they didn't go into listing them by town like we do now. And they're also listed geographically from north to south, and not alphabetically. The basis for these articles were the collection of Edward Grow. That collection was later donated to the INS, and I actually talk again a little bit about that. It wasn't published serially, so in some sense it was a serial series of articles, but it skipped several editions. It wasn't necessarily consistent. Sometimes it published corrections before finishing the initial list. A notable example of this is midway through the listing of New York tokens. It prints corrections to the Rhode Island tokens kind of inexplicably out of nowhere. It only published the tokens from Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York. It didn't publish all the states that issued them, notably Ohio, which probably issued more than any other state. And I think that the reason for this is because the articles themselves were not necessarily that popular. I have a letter to the editor from, I think this might have been either the second or third article, just prior to the article, where someone wrote a letter to the editor where they, quote, "cannot conceive why you would publish that list of copperheads. No one with any sense would waste his time collecting such trash." So that said, they clearly weren't that popular. Edward Grow, again, he donated his collection to the INS. He was buying them for less than a penny well through the 1880s and into the 1890s. So a lot of the tokens that he collected, they were traded, person to person during the Civil War for 1 cent. But then afterwards, once they lost their spending utility, they actually lost value for a couple of decades. War of the Rebellion tokens is another series of articles in the Coin Collector's Journal, 1882, 1883. Again, it largely used a collection of Edward Grow. By 1901, he had a massive collection, over 5,200 pieces when he donated it to the INS. He was actually the first, or this article was actually the first to arrange Civil War tokens by state and then by town and go alphabetically, which is generally how we organize them today. It also included mavericks, which are pieces that we don't necessarily know who issued them, pieces for collectors, as well as this is the first time that settlers were included as Civil War tokens. Pieces for collectors include such like off-metal strikings, including pieces struck in silver and very rarely sometimes even in gold. Those clearly didn't circulate as 1 cent pieces. Some of them are actually struck over dimes. So it wouldn't make much sense to take a dime and strike it with a Civil War token die and then spend it for 1 penny, unless you could sell it to a collector for more money. So those are pieces for collectors. The numerical system, the numbering system was numerical and began anew with each town, which, as you'll see, isn't necessarily how we do it today. But the number grew exponentially between the 1860s and the 1880s. Now we know of over 2,000 different pieces, which is quite amazing. Then we get to the 1924 Hetrich-Guttag Civil War Tokens and Tradesmen's Store Cards book. This was the first dedicated volume to Civil War tokens. Prior to this, you kind of had to be a subscriber to one of the magazines that were noted, and hopefully be able to piece together all these different articles to kind of get the whole picture of them. But again, in 1924, we have the first book that's totally dedicated to Civil War tokens. This was the first book to assign numbers, specific numbers, to obverse and reverse dies, rather than just have a whole list and start from one and go up from there. So you can see this photograph to the right has a bunch of obverse dies with images below each of them, or with numbers below each of them. And that was the die number that Hetrich and Guttag had given to those specific dies. In the 1880s, there was 2,000 Civil War tokens now known. Now we're up to over 8,500. So they really took the study of Civil War tokens quite seriously and studied them like no others had. 1,305 patriotics and over 7,200 store card tokens. So it's quite astounding the work that they were able to do. This was actually based off of a work by Edgar H. Adams, which was published in the Coin and Metal Bulletin in 1916, 1917. Unfortunately, the bulletin was a short-lived publication, and it ran only from those months from April 16th to March 17th. So the Adams articles were never published to completion. Adams then gave his research to Hetrich and Guttag, who then used that as the basis, and then were able to add exponentially to it. Here we have Dr. George Hetrich. His collection was several thousand pieces. It was sold by Pennypacker Auction House to a Mr. Barney V. Sipos of Indiana, Pennsylvania, who later also acquired Hetrich's notes and then loaned them to Melvin Fold, which is a name you probably, most of you probably know, but I'll still get to them, of course, in a little bit. As right now, Melvin and George Fold were the father and son team who really brought Civil War token collecting into the modern age. This is George Fold to the right, a young George Fold. I couldn't find a picture of Melvin, so I apologize to him. But they are really responsible for our modern understanding of Civil War tokens. Started really with a series of articles in the Numismatic Scrapbook magazine that became the basis for their groundbreaking book, Patriotic Civil War Tokens in 1960. The original cost for the book was only $1, so it brought Civil War tokens to the average collector. Basically even kids could have forked over a buck to get this book and really start understanding the significant series of coins. 1962, they published the companion book on Civil War store cards. They were also very active in buying complete collections. So in 1948, they acquired Joseph Barnett's 4,600 piece collection. Remember that name because I'll actually mention it again in a slide or two. Later, they purchased Guttag's 5,200 piece collection, as well as DC Wismer's 11,000 token collection. So needless to say, they had a lot of tokens. That's just 3 of the collections that they purchased over many, many decades. So I wouldn't be surprised if they had their hands on over 100,000 tokens during their career and really studied each of them painstakingly. The fold numbering system is still in use, even if these if someone else writes a book on Civil War tokens, they still rely on the fold numbering system just because it was so complete and just and really well put together. They were able to document 11,000 varieties. So as you can see, that's a far cry from the 303 that was produced in September of 1863. And it was by far the most comprehensive catalog at the time. Delisting Civil War tokens. Sometimes some of the books that people wrote and some of the articles that people wrote included things that weren't Civil War tokens. So by the 1960s, it became popular to call really almost any unlisted token that dated from the 1850s all the way to the 1880s as a quote unquote Civil War token. By doing so, you could increase its value by tenfold. Something that sold for, a buck could easily become a $10 token in the 1960s just by adding those three little words, Civil War token, to it. 1966, Arlie Slabaugh really spearheaded the effort to make sure that all Civil War tokens were in fact Civil War tokens and not something produced later. He successfully identified many tokens that were known and published prior to 1859, so clearly not Civil War tokens, as well as those made as late as 1880, and actually have two of the examples here. The top token was probably made in 1859, 1860, somewhere around there. The bottom one is from the late 1870s. So clearly not a part of the Civil War token series, but they were included as such prior to Slabaugh's research. Include several of the Civil War tokens, even named by Hetrich and Guttag, turned out to not be Civil War tokens. I mentioned Joseph Barnett earlier, who the Folds purchased their collection. One of the collections that they purchased was his. In 1940, and really even up in 42, 43, he was writing articles in the Numismatist, and Slabaugh felt that he went quote unquote overboard in what he was considering Civil War tokens. So he was delisting a lot of tokens that Barnett and Hetrich and Guttag and others had named as Civil War tokens. He does define Civil War tokens as those struck during the Civil War, not simply circulated, because under the premise that if something circulated, to some degree, even earlier hard times tokens from the 1830s and 1840s did make a brief reappearance and circulated a little bit. So if you considered stuff that just circulated during the Civil War, things get very muddy when you do that. So only struck during the Civil War. Even medalettes that were sold, rather than circulated, and small medals and such that people considered quote unquote Civil War tokens, he conclusively decided were not, and we, as collectors, still abide by his reasonings. So another major step forward in the understanding of Civil War tokens was the founding in 1967 by the Folds of the Civil War Token Society. Its mission statement is to, quote, unquote, stimulate interest and research in the field of Civil War token collecting. Makes sense. They publish a quarterly journal, which is now called the Civil War Era Numismatics, which was formerly for many, many decades called the Journal of the Civil War Token. They also provide an attribution service. They conduct auctions, and I have their URL listed there, cwtsociety.com, if you are interested in learning more about that organization. So I mentioned the Edward Growe's collection being donated to the ANS. By 1975, it's really interesting that nobody had actually gone and looked at it. Hetrich and Guttag had not looked at it. The Folds had not looked at it. But in January through March of 1975, a Civil War token collector named John Harris actually did get a grant from the Civil War Token Society to go look at it, and he found 181 unlisted varieties, and not just unlisted compositions or die combinations, but actually even new merchants. So completely new tokens that were not published prior to this, but always in this same place for at this point by 75 years because it was donated to the ANS in 1901. They're just sitting there open for research, and no one actually went and took the time to look at it. The second edition of the Fold catalog, well, let me backtrack a little bit. He published through the Civil War Token Society this pamphlet that you can see to the right, which is a catalog of unlisted Civil War tokens in the collection of the ANS. And then in the second edition of the Fold catalog, it contained a reprint of this catalog in the very end of the book. So there's two ways to get it, at least. Bringing us up to the modern times, Q. David Bowers wrote a guidebook of Civil War tokens. We all know the Red Book, of course, and in the 2000s, they started kind of breaking up sections and then expanding them. So all the way at the bottom of the spine, you can see number 16. So the Guide to Civil War Tokens is actually number 16 in a series of kind of like mini red books, but they're not so many. I think this one's well over 500 pages itself, which is longer than the actual red book. He wrote the first edition in 2013. Currently, this is quote unquote the book on the topic for a casual collector. I call it a casual collector because it doesn't go into every single variety like the Fold book does. But if you do want a deeper understanding of Civil War tokens as a series, this is certainly a book to get. So it does go through many of the series of the different varieties, but not only does it go through that, it also goes through the history of money before and during the Civil War, the history of collecting Civil War tokens, various methods of collecting Civil War tokens, as well as biographies of selected die engravers. And this is currently into the third edition, which is the one I have pictured here. Here's a few pages of the Guide to Civil War Tokens, just to give you, an idea that it's unlike many of the other things that we've looked at, which were essentially just lists of the different tokens that are known to exist. This really does, in Bowers's, method, does go into a deeper understanding of these pieces. There's also specialized books. I have 4 of them listed here. Wisconsin Civil War tokens. So not just, and we have books written on specific states. Indiana merchant issuers of Civil War tokens, Civil War store cards of Cincinnati, so even just of specific cities, and Civil War tokens of Rhode Island. These are 4 books that are written on specific areas of Civil War tokens, but I'm not even, couldn't even for the sake of time go into articles. There are hundreds, if not thousands, probably more like thousands of articles that have been, written on specific issuers or locations or types of Civil War tokens. But when you get to, book length monographs, it becomes a little bit easier to name just a few. But I don't want to necessarily ignore the articles. They're out there, but there's just way too many to actually discuss. So there are many ways to collect Civil War tokens. There's by major type, and even that there's kind of like subtypes where you can collect just patriotics, just store cards, or just the sutler tokens. You can focus on specific designs like just Indian heads or just those with flags or even stuff with just one specific motif like Civil War tokens with cannons, so on and so forth. You can collect by specific state and or city, just like I noted in those books. You can go thematically. You can do compositions. I think like a collection of just silver Civil War tokens would be pretty cool. You could do errors or overstrikes. I mentioned that some are overstruck on dimes, some are overstruck on copper nickel 1 cent pieces, some were actually overstruck on other Civil War tokens. So it can get pretty interesting. You can do graded or raw, or you can just go out and collect all of them, to your heart's desire. So that, again, there's many ways to collect them. And now we know that there are many different catalogs to help you collect them. So that's all I have. If there's any questions, again, you're more than welcome to put them in the Q&A if you haven't already. If you think of something later on, I do have my email address down at the bottom. So I know that sometimes when I watch a presentation, something strikes me 10 minutes after it ends. So please do note my email address if you would like to ask anything in the future. I'm going to hand it back off to Christian. Do you want me to end my screen sharing?
Sure, that way we can see your face better.
All right.
All right, so far we have 4 questions. So I'm just going to start with the first one.
All right.
How were these dies for the coins produced? Were they produced like the normal way US coin dies were made?
Yeah, they were made by engravers. Some of them probably used hubs, which is essentially a hub is essentially a die made to make dies. So a die for dies. So instead of being incused like a die, they would be raised, and then you could use those hubs to sink many dies to get essentially the same design over and over again with little differences between them. But yeah, they were essentially made the same exact way that US coins were at the time.
Okay. Despite the Coinage Act of 1864, didn't some people illegally make them and backdate them to 1863?
There may have been a few instances of that, but by 1865, there was absolutely no need to make them anymore because fractional currency and other different types, and also, of course, the smaller 1 cent pieces, they were made in such large quantities that it kind of negated any reason. There was really no profit in making them after the Coinage Act of 1864. There may have been a little bit of lag period where the mint didn't quite make as many as were needed to fulfill the economy. So sure, I'm not going to say that come the Coinage Act of 1864 that was the end all of them, but for all intents and purposes, yes, that was probably the end of most of them.
What is the history of the 1864 Lincoln OK Civil War token? Was it for his campaign or just given out as a patriotic support for Lincoln? I found information on the token, but nothing specific on why it was produced.
That was most likely a campaign token. He was he was a popular and not so popular person, depending on where you were at the time. And a lot of the Lincoln stuff pertaining to really most of the numismatic stuff pertaining to Lincoln was for his campaigns. There weren't too many. I actually don't think that any true Civil War tokens, circulated as such, contained Lincoln as a figure on them.
Are there good programs for YNs in the CWT Society?
There are. They're a good bunch of people, and they understand that some people are very well advanced and some people are just beginning. So there are programs and bits of advice out there produced by them for all ages and collecting habits. Absolutely.
How many copies of the G&H 1924 book were printed?
That I couldn't tell you. I want to say 250, but I can't be 100% certain. I think I may have read that in the beginning, the opening pages, but I apologize. I can't answer that definitively.
Come on, let's go. No, just kidding. I'm just kidding.
I want to say 250, but I could be mistaken.
Do we know the mintages of any of the tokens?
Only a few of them. I know that the Lindenmuller, they say 1 million pieces, and I don't know how exact that is or if it's a rough estimation. For the vast majority of them, no, we don't know the mintages.
Is there a price guide? If not, how would you price them?
Yeah, the David Bowers book does go into prices, and also the Roulau book on tokens, which not only covers Civil War tokens, but really all tokens of the 19th century does go into pricing. The Roulau book, I might be a little bit outdated now. I'm trying to think of when the last one came out. It may have been 2019. There may have been some in the 2020s. but they'll give you a decent understanding. You know, if something is pretty common or really rare, you know, you can get that information. You can deduce that from even a catalog that's 5 or so years old of Civil War tokens.
Okay. What is the rarest Civil War token in general?
What, can you repeat that? What is the rarest?
The rarest, yes.
There are some that there's only one known of, and there's actually quite a few that there's only one known of. Generally speaking, those from Wisconsin are pretty rare. I think that there's only 2 different varieties known from Wisconsin, you know, because it's way out west. And I think both of those varieties are pretty rare. But there's, you know, enough out there that, you know, you won't have to spend too much. But yeah, there are several Civil War tokens where there's only one known.
Okay. Some dies were cracked. Were some dies cracked even very early in their use?
Yes.
Yes, like it. That's the last question for right now. I'm gonna wait just another few seconds to see if anyone else pops up. We already have someone saying thank you. Okay, one more question. I live in Utah. Any cool ones I should look out for?
No, I don't think that there were any in Utah. I mean, the Civil War did make it out there, but they were still very reliant on gold and silver at that point. You know, that even though they're a part of the United States, really they were a territory at the time. They really did have a completely different economic history, even well into the 20th century, even than you know, the North and Midwest did. So they didn't necessarily have the need for Civil War tokens like the North and the Northeast and the Midwest.
Does the CWT focus on any other parts of numismatics of the Civil War era, such as encased postage stamps, fractional currency, etc.?
They do. And I really think that that's also one of the reasons why they changed the title of their journal to Civil War Era Numismatics, is because they weren't necessarily only focusing on the tokens, but really just all things numismatic that came out during the Civil War. So yes.
Right, I think that's it. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to Dr. Jesse Kraft for a great presentation. Our regularly scheduled Numisma Talks are being recorded and will be available to our members on our new e-learning academy at the end of April. Please be sure to check out for future programs on our website at money.org. Hopefully you'll join us tomorrow for other Numisma Talks, and I hope everyone has a great evening.
Thank you, Christian. Have a great night.
Thank you.